it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Wow, here we are. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dr. Z Show on Channel Z for discussion of evolutionary medicine in the apocalypse. And this is the first episode of 2022, so thanks for joining us for this. As always, I am your host, Dr. Z, aka Joe Alcock, MD. I'm a professor of emergency medicine at the University of New Mexico. Today, we're going to be talking about Omicron, what the future of the pandemic has in store for us, and this should be a good discussion. We've got some good folks joining us today. As usual, my co-host, Athena Actipus, is going to be with us. Hi, Athena.
Hey, Joe. Dr. Z, how's it going today?
Yeah, it's going good. I'm excited. I'm excited for today. In some ways, I'm optimistic about the pandemic, but we'll get into that with our guests. As you know, we have Jessica Brinkworth joining us, an evolutionary immunologist, biological anthropologist, and we got Andrew Reed, studies evolutionary genetics of infectious disease. Just amazing and accomplished people teed up to talk to us today. So
Absolutely.
I'm excited. How are you doing?
This is going to be just an awesome show. I mean, I have been thinking about just, what is our future with the pandemic for a long time. And now this question of, Omicron, right? And our show about Omicron and on and on and on. Like, how long is this going to go on? Do you think it's going to go on forever?
I've had my moments of, like I said, optimism. And we talked earlier about the fact that I actually had Omicron almost certainly at the very, very end of last year after Christmas. So I got it myself. And there were moments. Yeah, there were moments where, like, during the infection, I thought, okay, this is it. I will have this little thing, and it's, at least for me, thankfully, it wasn't that bad. And then you think, well, maybe I'm just done with this virus. And we've heard people articulate that on social media, in the media, in politics. I think that we don't want to get ahead of ourselves and be too optimistic.
You're blowing my mind, though, because I just realized there's a double meaning to Omicron and on and on. There's the pandemic going on, and then there's the long COVID issue, like how COVID messes with us in the long term. So I guess we're just going to deal with the first one, right? Today, we're going to deal with the nature of the pandemic. And we have some polls that we did on social media to ask people, what do they think? Is the pandemic going to go on and on and on?
What did they say?
Yeah, so let's take a look at those. All right.
There we go.
Okay.
I guess I'll read it. Is Omicron evolving to be a more benign virus? And what's the result there, Athena?
We got 44%. Yes, there's hope. 56% no, we're in for more on that one.
All right. And then this one, is Omicron evolving? This is the discussion, right? People talk about Omicron being not that big of a deal. In fact, I just said that myself, with the caveat that I'm still taking care of patients who are terribly sick in the hospital who have Omicron. But is it evolving to be more benign? So this is a Twitter poll that we put out, and we got most people being hopeful. So that seems to be at least part of the, at least of our respondents. Maybe we have a weird group that we're surveying. But I think we're going to get a counterpoint maybe with some of our guests.
Well, I think maybe it's time for us to bring on Andrew Reed.
Andrew Reed, welcome. This is Andrew Reed from Penn State.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining us. We mentioned a bit earlier that the last time that the two of us saw each other in a similar kind of format via Zoom, we talked about the state of the pandemic, and we both gave talks at a immunology conference in South Africa. And I remember two things that you said. One is that the pandemic is not done with us, and coronavirus is not done with us. And you predicted, I think, you were clairvoyant in saying that Delta was not the end. That's not the pinnacle, I think is what you said. Not the pinnacle of coronavirus evolution. And you also made the point that evolution kills. And it kills quite a lot of folks. So I was wondering what you thought about now that we're a few weeks into Omicron, what you think about the pandemic now.
Well, I'd like to say I'm a genius predicting that, but actually, of course, it was pretty obvious that there was going to be more variants. And I think it remains to the case that there will be more variants. And, in terms of where we're going in the longer term, I think there's going to be a lot of variants for an awful long time. So, this thing is still evolving, of course, and the world is changing as far as the virus goes. More and more people becoming immunized, different types of vaccines, different types of natural immunity. Everything is changing for the virus, and so it's going to continue to evolve.
Right. And we're getting some comments coming in. This is great. So thank you, audience, for commenting. The first comment had to do with someone making the observation that they thought, well, the pandemic might just last a couple weeks. And I think all of us have seen this, right? We've seen these little ups and downs with the caseloads, and we think, well, hey, it's going away. And people would articulate that and make us believe, some people, that it was going to be gone by early April or after Easter or whatever it was. And here we are. So yes, Jayla, I agree with that sentiment. I remember thinking something similar.
Yeah, honestly, I spent decades studying pathogen evolution, and we know they get more infectious through time. That's the nature of the evolutionary process.
Right.
And that's what's happening. And I had no reason to think that's played out at all, especially since we yet to see variants that do well transmitting in highly immunized populations. So things are really changing. I think this business of normal is all different now. Obviously, the virus is not moving through naive population now. It's moving through immunized populations. And so it's not going to be causing the same level of disease burdens as it was in the past. Because there's many fewer susceptibles in the population now. But nonetheless, it's going to be an issue going forward. I mean, we are much better off than we were, so I'm pretty optimistic on that. But we're going to get new variants that are trying new tricks and new things on us. And, it's very, very hard to predict where it's going to go. And I see that Neil here's got a comment about what doesn't kill us mutates and tries again. Actually, it's not trying to kill us. It's trying to transmit. And it's trying to transmit better than the other variants. And that's the process that's driving it. And sometimes that's associated with enhanced death rates. Sometimes it's associated with decreased death rates too. And actually, it's very, very tricky to know that in advance. And I think that's a really important question going forward. What is the relationship between disease symptoms and transmission?
But the great thing about being an evolutionary biologist is that in some ways you can see the future. And I think that you and other folks with that knowledge and your own research background, you can make the prediction that it's going to become more transmissible and it's going to evade our best immune defenses against it. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Sometimes it just goes away, right? SARS-1 went away. MERS went away. But if it doesn't go away, if it doesn't become extinct, then it does come back and becomes more transmissible.
I think we should go a little bit deeper into this question and this issue, right? Because I think there's an understanding that a lot of people have. Erica articulates this here, that it's in a virus's best interest to become more benign. And that's an inference, right? That's made from like, it's in the virus's interest to transmit. And if it transmits better by being more benign, then it will evolve to be more benign. But there are other ways for viruses to evolve to transmit really well, other than being benign. So what are some of those ways that viruses can evolve to transmit well that don't involve becoming more benign?
Yeah, so for example, I've been studying a virus of rabbits that was let loose in the rabbit populations in 1950. And it is still evolving like crazy. And what it is doing, it is immunosuppressing the host. So it is down-regulating the immune response of the host. So it is, in fact, doing more and more damage through time. So that's an example where it has got nastier in a standard animal model. It's got nastier through time. I think the way the SARS could do it most obviously, SARS-2, is that some of these symptoms, like coughing, for example, pretty helpful from a transmission perspective. Coughing and sneezing. So if there's a variant out there that could make us cough and sneeze more, even when we're vaccinated, that would have a transmission advantage. And presumably causing those symptoms is going to be something that's could be associated with more severe disease in the unvaccinated. So it's easy to imagine scenarios where this thing would evolve enhanced transmission via enhanced disease severity. But you could easily imagine going the other way too, as the sort of common thinking is.
Yeah. And as far as these predictions go, thank you, Andrew, for that. And now might be a good time to bring in Jessica Brinkworth to the conversation, and she can address the comment. What do we, maybe more transmissible but less powerful in terms of harming us?
So
what do you think? What do you think? And also, can you just sort of define how Omicron might be different from Delta and the previous variants? And I should mention, This is Jessica Brinkworth, biological anthropologist from the University of Illinois. She's an evolutionary immunologist, and she knows her stuff when it comes to viruses.
So Omicron has about 50 mutations, and 30 or so of them are occurring in this spike protein. And one of the things there's two things about that that are a tiny bit disturbing. The first is that there's a series of mutations that indicate, and it's been tested now at this point, that it's better at binding to ACE2, the receptor for spike. So those mutations create greater binding avidity, which is one of the reasons potentially why it might be more infectious. The second thing is that
Jessica, let's take a look at what Omicron looked like in November versus in December. So we see here we've got the arrow pointing to this little red cluster. This is the Omicron variant in November, and then if we look just the next month in December, see a giant explosion and lots of variants there as well. So just in terms of looking at the big picture, what we have is quite a huge expansion of Omicron and some variation there as well.
Yeah.
So lots of mutations that are doing interesting things.
Doing very interesting things. One of the things that's kind of concerning is that a number of them land in regions where the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines also bind. And we now have, we have numbers around the number of cases of people who are vaccinated who are also expressing symptoms, who are having a tough time recovering. Certainly vaccination helps and keeps people from dying, but I mean, the aim, there is no aim. There's the evolution that's happening around transmissibility is exactly what Andrew said. You'd expect that virus would become more infectious over time if it's not dying out. And the thing about Omicron that makes it really different from Delta, one of the things, is that you're infectious and can transmit on the first day. The average number of people that will
after being exposed.
So
amazing.
The average number of people that'll get it from one person, right, who's just wandering around doing their daily work, will be 10 maybe, whereas Delta, it was more like, I want to say it was like closer to 6. And it took a couple of days before you were infectious. So,
right.
I mean,
should we be wary of people who say, "Oh, I just have a cold"? I didn't get tested, but I just have a cold. I don't have a shortness of breath or a fever, and it's just a cold, and I'm sure I'm fine. Should I go to work?
I would emphasize what we've talked about most of this time, which is that we still think that at least 60% of the cases are asymptomatic. And we would expect that there'd be more asymptomatic cases with people being vaccinated too, right? So you should just follow the rules, man. Wear your masks, keep your distance. Nothing has really changed.
What about the testing issue that Liz brings up? Are tests more likely to be negative?
Not the PCR tests, but the antigen tests. So there's 40, some of them on the American market. Early on in December, some data was coming out that suggested that a number of these rapid antigen tests people were not testing positive until like day 5 or day 6, whereas we know you're transmissible on day 1. And so what I read coming out of the FDA was that the original cross-check on on a number of these tests was based on heat-killed virus. So the virus was heat-killed. Rapid antigen tests came out fine. They showed that the virus was there, it wasn't there. But when they started working sometime later with live virus that was out of like sputum, they weren't getting positives. Now, if you heat kill a virus, almost all of these detect nucleocapsid proteins. And so that's on the inside of the virus. And so, if you heat kill a virus, it's possible that you'd have more of that free floating and therefore would be more likely to end up with a positive. So, that might be why. But anyway, so your rapid antigen tests are slow.
And I think a rule of thumb, so you mentioned the PCR tests are still pretty good, sensitive and specific. So if it's negative, you might be negative, but not necessarily. I have relatives that fall into that category where they were positive. But at any rate, a positive test means you're positive, pretty much, whether it's an antigen test or a PCR test. So
I would say that a positive test means you're positive, and a negative test, at least as far as rapid antigen goes, means you don't know.
That's a good way of putting it. Great.
So we have a lot of questions in the comments about the CDC, and also just more generally, like how scientists can better communicate with the public about issues relating to the pandemic. Andrew, I'm wondering what are your thoughts about the trusted, authorities, governmental authorities and their recommendations? Do you think we should be just doing whatever the CDC says, or do you have reservations about what are your thoughts on CDC recommendations?
Yeah, I personally very much pay attention to the CDC recommendations, but also I start looking what's the data behind them, what's the logic, where it's come from. And there has been some situations recently, for example, that halving of the recommended quarantine period, isolation period, which seemed to be driven more by political concerns than data. So I do think we need to think that through. I would say, though, that it's obviously a very difficult environment these days to try to message science sensibly. And I think there's a lot that we scientists can learn. I think we need to be a lot more realistically humble about what we can and can't say and do and don't know. Perhaps there was a bit of oversell early on, which has not helped where we're at now. But I think shows like this go a long way, where people can try to discuss what we do think we know, and also disagree and discuss areas of uncertainty in a way which we can get across. I hope that there are things we don't know we're uncertain about. I do think we've had this, somehow we managed to give the public the view that scientists know everything, you just need to follow the science. Actually, the science is the bleeding edge of science is very, very fuzzy. Following the science, which isn't yet consensus, is very hard.
And this pandemic is a moving target, as we all know, and that's kind of why we're having this conversation.
It's not just knowledge gain, right? The virus itself is changing. So
so even knowing about the transmissible period, when or how often one is asymptomatic, how we should use tests, these are all kind of brand new. And the fact that the FDA just recently took away some of the monoclonal antibody treatments that we were using for many weeks or months for Delta, they don't work anymore. So it really is a moving target.
Evolution in action.
That's right.
We've got some other comments here about, what would the pandemic look like without social media? And, sort of related here, Ilana saying this, there's a messaging issue. So what are your thoughts, Jessica, about, what would things look like if there wasn't social media or there was better messaging?
Well, so I would say that the problems around public messaging on health issues long precede social media by decades. I mean, the anti-vaxxing movement has been around for decades before social media emerged. And it didn't even necessarily explode with social media. When I was working at Health Canada, there was always talk within ranks about the fact that this was an issue, or whether or not it was an issue. That was the biggest thing.
And misinformation too, right?
Yeah, even by people who were working in the government. It's really upsetting. So I will say that. The other thing is that I would say, so there are some good highlights about social media in the opening days of, end of April 2020, I had read every paper that could find, every paper that existed on SARS-CoV-2, and I had read the bulk of the coronavirus literature up to that point that had been written sometime between 1985 and now. I can't do that anymore. There's over 1,000 papers on SARS-CoV-2 published every day. So that's one of the things that helps me go through that is to follow scientists on Twitter and see what they're producing and see whether or not I agree. So it's been very useful, at least for me, in terms of just tracking stuff that it's of interest. Especially, I find Twitter very useful for that platform. And, there are PSAs that happen via social media. This is happening via social media. So, I mean, like, there's good things, right? The downside, obviously, is that misinformation travels fast. Disinformation travels faster. And I think that that's one of the greater issues, right? Is that it's been used as a political tool by foreign governments that have an interest in muddying waters. So what would it look like? I don't know. I mean, like, I think that there's some things around rapid messaging via social media that's been really helpful. We have whole populations that can't afford to pay cell phone bills and things like that. And so they use long distance bills and things. And so they use WhatsApp, for example, to communicate with their relatives, and they traffic media back and forth that way around what to do. Not all of that's going to be misinformation. Some of it's going to be the right information. The CDC uses it. WHO uses it. I mean, so there's good and bad information. I really wish that it didn't take Neil Young telling Spotify he was going to pull his what do you call it? Book. He was going to pull his book
repertoire.
Yeah, thank you. Off of the platform, and it took 2 or 3 other people to do that before they decided to get some sort of half-ass, half-measure apology out of Joe Rogan directly to them around misinformation. And I'm going to read more and things like that. I mean, there's very big damage that's being perpetrated by people like Joe Rogan and Alex Jones, and there's a nice long list of people that we can put on that. List.
All right, one more question for you. I agree with Erica's point here that the pandemic has really shown a light on the cognitive biases and blind spots that we have in our thinking, and we cannot think evolutionarily, which is also a problem of education, I might add. And dealing with probabilities and uncertainty is something that probably all humans have a hard time with, and maybe particularly with this moving target. But before you leave us, Jessica, I wanted to ask you, people talk about endemic as if the pandemic is ending, and and this kind of gets to some of the previous comments that maybe it's just not going to be as bad or as powerful or as harmful because it's endemic. What do you think about that?
Let's talk a little bit though about terms, right? So we have pandemic, right? So what is a pandemic? Let's get our definitions up. So that's when we have an infectious disease that's spread across a very large region, right? So
a big emic.
Yes, it's all over the place. And then what is endemic, Jessica? Tell us.
So endemic would be when you no longer need individuals coming in from the outside of a geographic region to maintain a constant level of infection. So it's there and it's circulating, and the current population is enough, and it appears to be circulating kind of in perpetuity.
So before we got on live, we were joking a little bit about whether endemic means that it's the end of the pandemic. That's not what it means, right? Endemic does not mean that it's over.
Huh.
Or does it? Cold viruses are endemic. It's not a big deal, right?
Plague is endemic. Plague is endemic in Colorado.
Yeah.
Let's hear from you, Andrew.
And I was about to say malaria is endemic in Africa. I mean, I think the issue here is that the public is getting mixed messages about what we really mean by endemic and pandemic. And to me, the issue is the public's more concerned about is when is it going to stop disrupting our lives? And that's a question of when it's circulating in an area, how much damage is it doing when it's circulating? And cold viruses don't do much damage, and flu viruses do more. And so we need to know where we're going to be at this thing as it starts to, variant after next and the variant after that. What's it starting to look like? And I think that we need to bear in mind the people that aren't lucky enough to respond well to vaccines or that are on chemotherapy, and so their immune systems are damaged. How's it going to affect those people? So, this thing is, just because it's changing from a, pandemic classification to an endemic situation doesn't mean there's any magic suddenly. It's not endemic. Right. It's not the end.
We might want to consider. Sorry for interrupting you.
But so many of us want it to be the end. And you see politicians like the Governor Paulus of Colorado talking about how we just need to live with it. It's almost like people want to give up. So is that the right answer?
Yeah, I saw that clip on Bill Maher too. I don't know if you saw that, but there was like a
Barry Weiss made a
editorial.
similar comment. She said she's done with the pandemic.
Yeah, and she can stuff it. That's an incredibly selfish point of view. It's an incredibly selfish point of view. A reminder that like the unvaccinated, it still includes children under the age of 5, right? That's still the case. And that's just here. Vast majority of the planet is unvaccinated. So like it's, you know, I think that we might want to consider that, or at least the public might want to consider that there's political signaling being used by using the term endemic and using it incorrectly to get used to this idea that, you know, you guys, like the economy, and we're going to get back to normal, as opposed to being reflexive, which would be the adaptive thing to do, would be, you know, the following, right? It would be like, you know, vaccine equity. We keep having this conversation, global vaccine equity, you know, releasing patents off the vaccines. It would be also, you know what, handling problems that are long running in nations where we are seeing these variants show up. It's not like, we don't really know where Omicron's from. We know it's very likely from South Africa. The thing that it's most closely related to was circulating in July. Right? So there's this big gap of 6 months of information about what happened in the meantime, which I think is pretty indicative of some of the problems that we're having, which means that like it's either, so it's occult, right? So it's either in an area that's not being surveyed, which is a problem. It's either popped out of an animal reservoir, which is very possible with COVIs and also a problem, or it came out of, and this is probably more likely, an immunosuppressed individual or immunosuppressed population. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest infection rate for HIV-1 worldwide and untreated, right? Largely untreated. And that's due to global inequity. That's due to wealthy nations hoarding wealth and not, you know, and all kinds of other issues that are surrounding, you know, the complex situation around why HIV-1 runs wild. So,
Jessica,
I mean,
yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think that we're in a tough situation though, right? Because many people are fatigued. They have burnout. You know, sometimes it's because just they're dealing with it in their daily lives. Other people have it because, you know, they're working in the healthcare system.
Right.
And so there is a real phenomenon of
I agree.
people, you know, being burnt out. And so then how do we both sort of respect the fact that like people are burnt out, but also deal with the reality of the situation that we're in? And actually,
I would say that the problem here is a lack of flexibility and adaptability. You want to be able to like roll back school attendance, and to do that when, you know, things are flaring up. And to do that, you need to give like extended maternal or, you know, family leave. You need to give, you know, economic support, paid leave to hourly workers. I mean, these are the things that are necessary, and they have to happen higher up than state governments to ensure that it's, you know, it's going to be in place. This burnout is in part due to policy. It's not wholly, you know, it's not wholly due to the circumstances of the pandemic. It's the circumstances of the pandemic with a layer of government on top, right? So that's that. And I would still say that people dying in lower income nations in large numbers matters more than my feeling of exhaustion having like homeschooled 2 children for 2 years. It just does. Like my exhaustion is not the same as multiple people dying. It just isn't.
Good points. And there's lots of good comments that are going by that I wish we could address all of them.
Yeah.
I do want to make a comment.
Let's hear from Andrew though, because he's.
I just wanted to make a quick comment that, you know, 2,000 Americans are dying a day at the moment, and it's all very well to say it's all right. It's all just, we're sick of it, but it's still 2,000 Americans dying a day. And honestly, just to say we don't need to worry about it anymore while that's happening, I just find it incredible. Incredible.
So, Andrew, tell us what your predictions are for the future.
My predictions are there will be more variants.
Mm-hmm.
There will be more variants for many, many years to come. I think that they will be causing, because of the levels of immunity in the population, there will be many people that experience these new variants as pretty mild. I think some of the variants will cause more severe disease in immunosuppressed people or people who haven't seen the virus or the vaccine before.
Well, there you have it. There you have it, folks. I do want to make the point. We did have a slide earlier to say that despite our concern and reasons for pessimism, vaccines still work. right? So that's and
Good.
Jessica said that's our. So there we go. So the top
What's your
line is
happy
unvaccinated. This is your risk of hospitalization. It's vaccines. If you're boosted, it still provides upwards of 95, 97%, depending on the age group, of protection from hospitalization and death, which is just massive. And it is a true success story for modern medicine. Yeah.
Oh wow, Stuart.
Yeah.
That's awful.
Right. All these how people are dealing with sick call. There's so many topics to get into. But I have to say, I think that we're just about out of time.
Yeah.
Are we,
I was
Athena?
just going to add to Andrew's comment. I think that maybe one thing we want to do,
Right.
at least, as part of like a coping, is trying not really to think about exactly where this is going. I think that since the very beginning, there's been this drive, return to normal, return to normal, return to normal. And every time there's a policy push for return to normal, we must return to normal. It does two things, right? We see a flare up in the number of cases, and then we see, resulting burnout and resistance. And then we also, people die as a result. Why not, be more adaptable? Let's try to think about new things, like, not return to normal, but creating like a new future. Maybe that's like a different framing. It'd be nice as policy messaging anyway.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming thinking about all this stuff. And there's so much more to talk about. So I agree with that comment, Liz. Trying to do the right thing in medicine and in public health. Seriously challenging, oftentimes undermined, difficult, but we can be certain that the virus is going to continue to evolve, as Andrew has mentioned.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us, Jessica. Do you have any final thoughts to leave us with?
No, I think I just made my final thought. Sorry, that was it. I might have just like blurted out all of my emotions.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing your points of view, Jessica and Andrew.
Andrew, how about you? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess to Jessica's point about thinking about a new future, there are coronaviruses in the poultry industry, and they have new variants coming up all the time. The variants that come up are in different places in different parts of the world. They have to adjust the vaccines to respond to the local conditions, and that's their world. That's what happens with those coronaviruses: constant evolution, constant adjustment of the vaccines, the schedules, what's being done. That might be a way we end up here too.
Yeah. But that does make me worry about the people for whatever reason either cannot be vaccinated or refuse vaccination.
I completely agree.
They're really in trouble.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Athena. Thanks, Jessica. And that wraps up another episode of the Dr. Zed Show. Thanks for joining us for this truly apocalyptic discussion with some bright spots like vaccines. Do get your booster if you've not done that. So join us again for our next episode. And until then, be well.
It's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.